Have you ever been asked to write an in-class essay where you spend the first 7 to 10 minutes of the period just sort of wondering what to put on paper? Well, today what I'd like to do is share with you how you can actually begin in the middle. Now I have lined paper below because I'd like to illustrate that what you can do is skip the first 3 or 4 lines of your paper and begin with the prompt. Whatever the prompt is, your answer to that is the thesis. Once you know your thesis statement, which actually belongs in the introduction, but you can have a draft of it, you only need one sentence from your intro, then you're ready to begin. So for example, if this were my essay and I had to start, the first thing I would do is skip to about right here on the page. And this is where I would actually start, and I'll reserve all of this for my introduction. When I'm all warmed up and I finish with my actual essay, then I can go back and do the introduction. Now, once I know the thesis, I can also refine it at the end, but I want to begin right away. Does this look familiar? This is actually the poem or poems that we referred to last week when dealing with the naturalist literary movement for Wordsworth and Frost. And in this prompt, the prompt asks us specifically to address the attitude and the techniques that each poet uses to talk about the encounters with nature. In this case, I color-coded it. Now, when we looked at this in class, we annotated it fully for Tips Fast. But what I did here was narrow it down to exactly what the prompt was asking for. And that's what you need to be able to do as well. So my key in here, the pink is the attitude or the tone, and the blue highlight is actually the techniques that each poet uses. So when I go to explicate, I can begin my work focused on what the prompt requires. Now, if you recall, last week I sort of told you how to explicate a poem. Today what I want to do is show you what one looks like. I want to share with you my cheat sheet for looking for one of the points that are addressed in the prompt. One thing that's required of us is to take a look at the tone that's expressed in both poems. And so we know that Wordsworth uses a positive tone, so I selected jubilant. And then I also know that Frost selected a very negative tone towards the encounter with nature. So from this list, I selected disappointed tone. Let's take a look to see how that actually fits in with our thesis statement. So here is my thesis to the answer. And remember, this is just the draft. Once I have this, I'm ready to go. I always start with the condition group, which is even though, or it can be although, or in spite of, or though, or if, despite. So my phrase is, even though both poems reflect the works of naturalist writers. Now, after the commas, we're actually answer the question. Wordsworth expresses encounters with nature with a jubilant tone, primarily through the use of imagery. So remember, the prompt asks us to tell us the attitude and the techniques. I've addressed both. Whereas, so I'm using the transition for compare contrast, Frost illustrates an attitude of disappointment, which is the tone, right? Primarily through sound. And so when I say sound, I can cover alliteration, I can cover rhyme scheme. So I'm being very general here in my thesis statement. This is a rather strong thesis statement, and if I were to start writing my essay and I want to go back and draft it or refine it, I can always do that. Now let's take a look at the actual prompt that we've been working with this week for the postmodernist literary movement. And our featured poet is John Updike in his poem entitled The Great Scarf of Birds, which is a rather interesting poem. And as we discovered today in our Socratic seminar, has quite a bit of layers to it. Anyways, this prompt only requires us to look at the organization, the diction, and also the figurative language. And how does all three of these components help prepare us as the reader to understand the final 2 lines of the poem. Now here you can see the final 2 lines of the poem. Everything we do today is going to be centered around these 2 lines. Whenever we discuss the poem, we want to make sure that we answer the prompt in terms of how does everything else, the diction, the organizational structure of the poem, the figurative language, help prepare us as the reader to really grasp the last 2 lines of the poem, which reads, long had it been since my heart had been filled, had been lifted, as if it were the lifting of the great scarf. So this is significant because there is a stark contrast to the rest of the poem. Let's take a look to see what a thesis statement might look like. Now here is my thesis statement, and again, I like to start with in spite of, like a condition group, in spite, despite, although, even though. Those are great phrases. In spite of the shift in impressions of the bird in stanza 3, comma. Now all of that is prior to me answering the question. Now here's where I address the actual question, and this is my answer. The speaker prepares the reader for the immense tenderness and fondness of the ascending birds through formal diction. So remember, I didn't just say diction, I described the type of diction that was used, and I can be very specific when I go to explicate the poem. But in this case, I found the diction to be rather formal. And diction just means word choice. What words does the poet use to convey his message? And then spatial organization. So there are different ways that a poem may be organized. In this case, I felt like Updike had, or the speaker in this case, really organized the poem in a way that talked about the different settings. First, it was the tree, and then it was the sky, and then it was the golf course. So for me, it was spatial. And then we have pronounced similes. Of course, we're probably going to want to talk about imagery and any of the alliteration that Updike uses in the poem. And so I might have to go back and refine this when I go to finalize my thesis statement. Most of which expresses great appreciation for the shape of the birds in the air. Now that's my answer to the question. You might think this is rather complex, it's rather lengthy, but remember, the thesis statement is the most important statement or sentence in your entire essay. And so what you want to do is you want to draft it early so that you can begin, like I said, in the middle. So I hope that was helpful to actually see an example of what it looks like to explicate a poem. Now remember, this was the body paragraph of the poem, but I hope you found it helpful in the sense that you were able to see, because remember before I told you, now I wanted to show you what it looks like to explicate, to go line by line, to take the different techniques and then discuss how it impacts the line, and the next or subsequent sentence would sort of illustrate how this understanding of the technique, whatever it is, supports the idea of the entire poem. And so that's exactly what you saw, and I hope that was helpful and you have a copy for your own records.